They exiled humanity from the galaxy, Earth's response. A smirk, then total freedom. The hall was enormous, big enough to hold 1,000 beings from 100 different worlds, and on this particular day, it was full. Every seat was taken. Every screen across the galaxy was tuned in. The Galactic Conclave had not called a full session like this in over 300 years, and everyone who was anyone knew exactly why they were here today. Humanity was on trial. The chamber smelled like recycled air and tension. Delegates from 47 civilizations sat in curved rows that rose toward the ceiling like the inside of a great shell. Some of them had scales. Some had feathers. Some breathed through filters attached to their faces. But all of them were watching the same thing, the single long table at the center of the chamber where the human delegation sat, calm and quiet, like they had come to watch a sporting event rather than hear judgment passed on their entire species. At the head of the human table sat Director Cira Vance. She was a small woman by most standards, short hair gone mostly gray, sharp eyes behind thin-framed glasses, and a stillness about her that had always made people uncomfortable in ways they could never fully explain. She had been Earth's senior diplomatic representative for 19 years. She had sat in this chamber dozens of times. She had shaken hands with beings who had lived for centuries, and she had never once looked rattled. Today was no different. Grand Speaker Voth Kharon rose from the central platform. He was old, older than most civilizations in the room had been space-faring. His scales were a deep, faded green, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the kind of weight that came from absolute certainty. He had never once in his long life been told no by anyone whose answer mattered to him. He looked down at the human delegation the way someone might look at a cracked window, something that had been allowed to stay too long and was now a genuine problem. The Galactic Conclave has reviewed the case against the species known as Homo sapiens of the third planet in the Sol system, he said, his translated voice rolling out flat and formal through every earpiece in the room. The charges have been read. The evidence has been presented. The deliberation has concluded. He paused for effect. The room was so quiet that the ventilation hum seemed loud. Charge 1. Uncontrolled territorial expansion into regions marked as protected or unclaimed under conclave law. Confirmed. A murmur moved through the delegates like a wave. Charge 2. Repeated violations of diplomatic protocol, including unauthorized contact with non-member civilizations and trade agreements formed outside of conclave oversight. Confirmed. The murmur grew slightly louder. Charge 3. Biological and cultural contamination risk due to the species' unpredictable behavioral patterns, aggressive adaptive tendencies, and refusal to conform to established galactic social standards. Confirmed. Now the room was buzzing. Delegates were leaning toward each other, whispering in their own languages. Some looked satisfied. A few looked nervous. A very small number looked something close to guilty, though none of them would have admitted it. Director Vance did not move. She had her hands folded on the table in front of her. She was watching Voth Kharon the way you might watch a clock, simply waiting for it to finish. The ruling of the Galactic Conclave is as follows, Voth Kharon continued, drawing himself up to his full height. The species known as humanity is hereby formally exiled from the galactic community, effective immediately upon the conclusion of this session. All hyperlane access codes assigned to human vessels are revoked. Earth's coordinates will be sealed within a quarantine veil maintained jointly by 6 member civilizations. No trade agreements with human entities will be recognized. No human vessel will be granted transit rights through any conclave-controlled corridor. No communication of a diplomatic nature will be accepted from Earth or any human-controlled territory. He let that sit in the air for a moment. Humanity is removed from the galaxy until such time as the conclave determines, if ever, that the species has demonstrated sufficient maturity to rejoin the community of civilized worlds. The room erupted. Some delegates stood and applauded. Some sat very still. The screens broadcasting across hundreds of worlds would later show the moment from 17 different angles: the full chamber, the clapping delegates, the towering figure of Voth Kharon, and at the center of it all, the small human woman sitting at her table, hands still folded, face completely unreadable. Voth Kharon looked directly at her. It was the kind of look meant to land like a blow, a look designed to make someone feel small, defeated, and finished. He had used it before, and it had always worked. "Let them wither behind their little star," he said, quieter now, almost to himself, but the microphones caught it. They were never ready. Director Sira Vance looked up at him. And she smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a nervous smile or a sad smile or the kind of smile someone makes when they are trying to hold themselves together. It was something else entirely, calm and knowing and just slightly amused, like she had heard a joke that only she understood the punchline to. It was there for only a few seconds, and then she closed her datapad, straightened her jacket, and began collecting her things. No protests, no demands, no speeches, no tears. Just the smile. Voth Kharon stared at her. For the first time in longer than most civilizations had been alive, he felt something cold move through him. He had expected anger or grief or desperation. He had not expected that expression, that quiet, unbothered, almost satisfied expression, and he did not know what to do with it. Several other senior delegates noticed it too. The Arathi ambassador, a being who had studied human behavior for 40 years, leaned toward his aide and said in a low voice that the human woman's reaction was wrong, that it did not fit any of the models. The aide asked what he meant. The ambassador did not answer right away. He kept watching Vance as she rose from her chair, nodded once to the chamber at large as though acknowledging a routine meeting, and walked calmly toward the exit. The conclave session continued. Procedural items were addressed. The mechanics of the quarantine veil were confirmed. Hyperlane revocations were officially logged. It was thorough and efficient and carried the full weight of galactic law. None of it touched Director Vance, who was already in the corridor, walking at an easy pace toward the docking bay where the Earth shuttle waited. Her aide, a young man named Petros, fell into step beside her. He had been present for the entire session. His face was pale and his hands were unsteady, and he had very clearly been holding himself together through pure willpower for the last several hours. "Director," he said carefully, "what do we do?" Vance did not slow down. She was looking ahead at the end of the corridor, at the door that would take them back to their ship. "We go home," she said. "And then?" Petros asked. She glanced at him sideways, and there it was again, that expression, quiet and certain and carrying something in it that he could not quite name. "And then we get to work," she said. That was all she said for the rest of the walk to the shuttle. Petros did not ask anything else. He was not sure he wanted to know more yet, because the way she said it, calm and almost cheerful, like someone who had just been handed exactly the opportunity they had been waiting for, made him feel two things at once. The first was fear. The second, surprising him completely, was hope. Behind them, in the great chamber, the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy celebrated the removal of humanity from their ranks and congratulated themselves on finally solving what they called the human problem. They had no way of knowing, as the applause filled the hall and the votes were logged, and the quarantine veil preparations began, that they had not solved anything at all. They had simply started a clock. And somewhere out past the edge of charted space, in a small research station orbiting silently in the dark beyond the Uit cloud, a team of exhausted and brilliant human scientists were staring at a data readout that had just changed everything. And one of them was already drafting a message to Director Vance marked urgent and eyes only. The galaxy had just made its move. It had no idea that humanity had already made theirs. They exiled humanity from the galaxy, Earth's response. A smirk, then total freedom. The Conclave watched the Sol system for 3 years after the exile and found nothing alarming. No distress signals, no attempts to breach the quarantine veil, no rogue human ships trying to sneak through the hyperlane corridors under false registration. The 6 civilizations assigned to maintain the veil reported routine readings. Energy levels at the barrier were stable. The humans were quiet. The Conclave took this as confirmation of what it had always suspected, that without access to the broader galaxy, humanity would simply run out of steam. Cut off their trade, cut off their travel, cut off their ability to expand, and the pressure that had made them so disruptive would have nowhere to go. They would turn inward. They would argue among themselves. They would fracture along the old fault lines, national, ideological, cultural, that had defined human history for centuries before they ever reached for the stars. Vothcharon himself said as much at a closed session 2 years after the exile, when a junior delegate from the Eschari Federation raised a concern about long-term monitoring costs. They are already fatting, Vothcharon said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. A species that feeds on expansion has been denied the ability to expand. What follows is natural and inevitable. We will check on them in 50 years and find a much smaller, much quieter civilization that has finally learned its place. The junior delegate sat down and did not bring it up again. What the Conclave did not see, what no external observer could have seen through the quarantine veil, was what was actually happening inside Sol's system. It started in the first month. Director Vance returned to Earth and went directly into a closed meeting with the Terran Coordination Council, the loose governing body that had overseen humanity's interstellar activities. She placed 2 things on the table. The first was a full record of the Conclave's verdict and the technical specifications of the quarantine veil. The second was a forwarded message from a research team at UIT Station 7, a message that, once read by everyone in the room, produced a silence that lasted almost 2 full minutes. The team at UIT Station 7 had successfully folded a physical object through space without using a hyperlane. It was small, a probe roughly the size of a human fist. It had been folded 40 astronomical units and retrieved intact. The fold had taken 11 seconds from initiation to recovery. The data was clean. The result was repeatable. The lead researcher on the project, a physicist named Dr. Amara Osai, had written at the bottom of the report in plain text, "We don't need their roads anymore." The room absorbed this for those 2 quiet minutes. Then someone said, "How long to scale it?" And the meeting turned into something that ran for 16 hours without a break and ended with 17 separate working groups being formed before sunrise. The Conclave had expected humanity to collapse inward. Instead, humanity collapsed inward on purpose, in the way a spring collapses when you press it down, storing force, waiting. The old national governments did not disappear overnight. That was not how humans worked, but something shifted in the years that followed, something practical and unsentimental. With no interstellar economy to argue over, with no trade routes to compete for, with the shared reality that every human being alive was now on the same side of a wall built by someone else, the incentive structure changed completely. Old rivalries did not vanish. Old arguments did not go away. But for the first time in human history, there was a common project that mattered more than any of them, and everyone knew it. Resources that had gone toward political competition began going elsewhere. Scientists who had spent careers on separate continents working on competing versions of the same problem were suddenly in the same rooms. Military budgets were redirected, not abolished, not wasted, but aimed with a precision that peacetime politics had never allowed. The organization that emerged from this was not a government in the traditional sense. It called itself the Terran Compact, and it was less a ruling body than a logistics engine. It made decisions about resource allocation, project priority, and collective direction. It did not tell people what to think or how to live. It simply kept the machine running, and the machine had one primary output: fold technology. Dr. Osai led the program. She was brilliant and demanding, and had no patience for process that did not produce results. She had a habit of walking into meetings already knowing what she was going to say, and leaving the moment the relevant decisions were made. Her team grew from 40 researchers to 400 in the first 2 years, and to several thousand within a decade. Pulling from every technical discipline humanity had: physicists, engineers, mathematicians, materials scientists, and a surprising number of people from fields no one would have predicted. Because fold space transit turned out to require thinking that cut across every boundary human knowledge had ever drawn. Progress was not smooth. There were failures, some of them expensive, a few of them dangerous, one of them catastrophic in a way that set the program back 8 months and sent Dr. Osai into a silence that lasted 2 weeks before she came back to her desk and started again. No one asked her to. She simply did. 10 years after the exile, they could fold a vessel the size of a small shuttle. 20 years in, they had folded a crude ship for the first time. The crew of 3 had experienced a journey of several light minutes as an event that lasted, from their perspective, about 4 seconds. When they landed back on the station and were helped out of their seats, the lead pilot, a woman named Chitty Farrow, looked at the medical team waiting for her and said she felt fine and asked if there was coffee. There was coffee. She had 2 cups and then submitted a 14-page technical report from memory within the hour. 30 years after the exile, the Terran Compact began construction of its first fold-capable warships. Not because humanity intended to fight, but because the people who had grown up under the quarantine veil had done so knowing exactly what the Conclave was, exactly what it was capable of, and exactly what happened to civilizations that had no ability to defend themselves. They built the ships carefully, and they built them well. The quarantine veil's custodian civilizations continued their rotations. Their sensors swept the Sol system on schedule. They recorded power readings, tracked known spacecraft registrations, logged the occasional burst of communication signals they could not decode, and flagged for review before eventually filing as non-threatening. One monitoring officer on a Veil station rotation wrote in a personal log that she sometimes thought the humans seemed too quiet, that the stillness felt less like defeat and more like held breath. Her supervisor marked the note as the product of extended solo posting and reassigned her to a different station. The Conclave held its annual review of the exile's status and found nothing to change. 40 years, then 45, then 48. The galaxy went on. Trade moved through the hyperlanes. New disputes arose between member civilizations and were resolved through the usual slow machinery of conclave diplomacy. Younger species on the edge of qualifying for membership were assessed and observed and told to wait. The conclave managed everything it had always managed, in the way it had always managed it, with the quiet confidence of something that had never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong. In Sol system, a fleet was almost ready. And in a viewing room aboard the largest vessel in that fleet, an old woman who had once sat in the conclave chamber and smiled at the most powerful figure in the galaxy sat in a chair with a blanket over her knees, watching the shipyard lights through a long window, and waited for the moment she had known was coming since the day she walked out of that hall and never looked back. They exiled humanity from the galaxy, Earth's response. A smirk, then total freedom. 3 months before the conclave trial, Director Sierra Vance had been standing in a cold corridor on Uit Station 7, reading a message on a handheld screen, and she had felt something shift inside her chest. Something she would later describe to exactly one person as the sensation of a key turning in a lock she had forgotten was there. The message was from Dr. Amara Osai, and it was flagged urgent and eyes only. It was 7 sentences long. The last sentence read, "Director, I think you need to come see this in person because I don't believe it myself yet, and I wrote the math." Vance had taken a shuttle out the next morning. She had told no one where she was going and listed the trip in official records as a routine inspection of outer system monitoring infrastructure. She arrived at Uit Station 18 hours later, shook hands with Osai, and was taken immediately to the laboratory bay where the Fold Drive prototype was housed. The device itself was not impressive to look at, a dense tangle of equipment surrounding a test chamber about the size of a wardrobe, connected to more processors than the station had originally been designed to support, with temporary cables running across the floor in bundles that someone had taped down with the kind of resigned practicality that meant they had given up pretending this was a tidy operation. The probe sat inside the chamber on a small platform. Osai walked her through the theory in 20 minutes. Vance was not a physicist, but she was one of those rare people who could follow a new idea quickly enough to ask the right questions, and her questions were good. Os answered all of them without hesitation. When the explanation was finished, Vance looked at the device for a long moment. "Show me," she said. Osai ran the test. The probe vanished. The instruments recorded the fold event, a spike and then nothing, clean and fast and complete. 40 astronomical units away, a receiver station registered arrival. 11 seconds after initiation, the same probe was recovered from a retrieval chamber on the other side of the station. Intact, undamaged, as if it had simply stepped through a door. Vance stared at the recovered probe sitting on its tray. "How long have you had this working?" she asked. "Repeatable results for 6 weeks, Osai said. "Before that, 2 months of partial successes that I wasn't willing to call confirmed." Vance nodded slowly. "And who else knows?" "My team of 9, and now you." Vance picked up the probe. She turned it over in her hands. It was warm, residual energy from the fold, Osai explained. She held it for a moment and then set it carefully back down. "The Conclave is going to exile us," she said. It was not a question. She had seen the direction the case was moving for months. She knew the votes. She knew Voth Charon. "The trial is in 12 weeks. The verdict is going to go against us. I have known this for a long time." Osai said nothing. She had suspected as much. Most people with access to diplomatic intelligence had. "I need you to understand something," Vance continued. "If this technology is real, and I believe it is, then the exile changes its meaning entirely. We built our interstellar capability on conclave infrastructure, their hyperlanes, their corridors, their permissions. Every time a human ship went anywhere, it was because they allowed it. We were guests at a table they owned." She looked at Osai. "If we can fold, we don't need their table. We don't need their corridors. We don't need their permissions or their access codes or their good opinion. They cannot revoke what we don't use. They cannot block roads we haven't built yet." Osai was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They would be exiling us from a network we were about to stop needing anyway." "Yes," Vance said, "and they would be removing every treaty obligation, every diplomatic agreement, every behavioral standard we accepted in exchange for membership. The moment they exile us, we are no longer bound by conclave law. We owe them nothing. We answer to nothing they have ever built." The word she used next was not something Director Vance said often. She was a careful woman with careful language, but she said it quietly, without drama, like someone reading a fact off a page. "Freedom," she said, "complete and total and given to us by the people who thought they were punishing us." She had walked into the conclave trial 12 weeks later carrying that knowledge the way you carry something precious, carefully, with both hands, without letting anyone see it. She had sat through every charge. She had listened to every confirmation. She had watched Voth Charon rise to his full height and deliver the verdict of a governing body that had stood for 3,000 years. And she had felt nothing but a deep, clear certainty that she was watching someone hand her exactly what she needed while believing with complete confidence that he was taking something away. When he looked at her and said, "Let them wither behind their little star," she had smiled because there was simply no other response that fit. Not anger, not grief, not defiance. Just the smile of someone who knows the punchline before the joke is finished. Now, 50 years later, that same woman sat wrapped in a blanket in a viewing room aboard the TCS Unbound and looked out at a fleet that had not existed when she was young. She was 91 years old. She had outlived 3 Terran compact administrations, 2 chief engineers, and 1 doctor who had told her firmly at the age of 84 that she needed to slow down. She had not slowed down. She had instead attended every major project review, read every significant technical report, and appeared without warning at a manufacturing facility when a schedule slipped by more than 2 weeks, which had a remarkable effect on the schedule. She was officially retired. She had been officially retired for 11 years. No one had fully believed it. Commander Idris Akafer found her in the viewing room at 400 hours, ship time, when he had come to do a final walkthrough before the fleet's departure. He was 38, sharp and steady, the kind of officer who inspired confidence by never appearing to need it himself. He stopped when he saw her. "Director," he said, because no one in the compact had ever managed to call her anything else regardless of what her official title was. "You should be resting." "I will rest later," she said without turning from the window. He came and stood beside her. They both looked out at the fleet, 140-fold capable vessels of various sizes, crewed by people who had been born under the quarantine veil, who had grown up knowing the story of the Trial and the Smirk, who had built these ships with their own hands and their own minds, and the fierce, patient energy of a species that had been told it was finished, and had found this information incorrect. "Are you afraid?" she asked him. He thought about it honestly, because she was not someone you gave easy answers to. "No," he said, "I think I should be, but I'm not." She nodded like this was the right answer. "They will be afraid," she said. "The conclave, the member species, all of them, when we appear, there will be fear. I want you to remember something when that happens." "What?" he asked. She finally turned from the window and looked at him directly. She was old and small and wrapped in a standard-issue blanket, and she had the steadiest eyes he had ever seen on a human being. "We are not going back to take revenge," she said. "We are not going back to rule anything or punish anyone or prove a point. We are going back because the galaxy is ours as much as it is anyone else's, and because there are civilizations out there who were excluded from the conclave's table just like we were, and they deserve better than what they have been given. Do you understand?" "Yes, Director," he said. She turned back to the window. "Good," she said, "then go fly my ship." He almost smiled. He straightened, nodded once, and left her to her window and her stars. She sat there until the lights in the shipyard began their pre-departure sequence, and the hum of 100-fold drives warming up moved through the walls of the ship like a quiet, enormous pulse. She placed one hand flat against the viewport glass, as if she could feel the galaxy on the other side of it. Maybe she could. 50 years, she said to no one quietly in the empty room. Not bad. Then she allowed herself, for the first time since that day in the conclave chamber, to smile again, and this time there was nothing restrained about it at all. They exiled humanity from the galaxy, Earth's response. A smirk, then total freedom. The quarantine veil had been maintained for 50 years, without a single significant incident. The 6 civilizations assigned to its upkeep had settled into a comfortable routine. Their monitoring stations were staffed by officers who considered the posting quiet, good for career stability, low on drama. The veil itself was a marvel of conclave engineering, a layered energy barrier that covered the entire Sol system and made hyperlane transit in or out of the region simply impossible. It had been built to keep humanity in and the rest of the galaxy out, and it had done exactly that without complaint for half a century. On the morning it stopped working, the shift supervisor at Veil Station 4 was halfway through a meal and thinking about his upcoming leave rotation. The alert that came through was not the kind he had been trained to handle. It was not a breach from the inside, not an attempt to punch through from the Earth side, not a power fluctuation or a structural failure. The veil was simply dissolving, from the inside, in every sector simultaneously. The energy that had maintained it for 50 years was just draining away, layer by layer, in a pattern that the station's systems had no category for and could not explain. It took 4 minutes for the veil to come down completely. It took another 6 seconds for 140 ships to appear. They did not come through the quarantine veil's location. They did not use the hyperlane corridors that ran near Sol. They simply materialized, all 140 of them, simultaneously in 17 different star systems across a corridor of space that stretched 30 light-years from edge to edge. Not a coordinated arrival through any existing infrastructure. Not a stealth approach picked up late. Just empty space, and then ships as if the universe had blinked. The Veil Station supervisor dropped his meal. The emergency alert that went out from the monitoring network to Conclave Central took 11 minutes to transmit. By the time it arrived, other monitoring posts were already sending their own reports. Ships spotted near the Arathi border, ships holding position at the edge of the Eschari system, ships appearing without warning in the open corridor near the trade hub at Velmora Station. All human, all broadcasting standard identification signals, all completely calm. None of them fired a weapon. None of them moved aggressively. They simply existed, positioned across a swathe of galaxy that the Conclave had considered entirely under its control, and broadcast on open frequencies in every registered language that anyone wanted to talk. Grand Speaker Letharu was the third to hold the title since Voth Charon. He was younger than his predecessor, and generally considered more flexible in his thinking, which was another way of saying he had personally witnessed enough unexpected things to know that surprises happened. He had, in private, occasionally wondered whether the exile had been handled as carefully as history recorded it being. He was not wondering that now. Now he was in emergency session with the senior delegates of the conclave, staring at a tactical display that showed red markers, human ships, spread across the region like a scatter of seeds, and trying to control a room that had stopped being controllable approximately 8 minutes ago. "They cannot be there," said the Arathi delegate. "The veil." "The veil is down," said the coordinator from the monitoring division for the third time. "That is not possible. I am looking at the readings. They went through it somehow." "They did not go through it." The coordinator's voice was tight with the effort of staying professional. "There is no residual signature consistent with a breach. The ships appeared inside the perimeter and outside it at the same moment. They did not transit the veil. They bypassed it entirely. They bypassed the hyperlanes entirely. I do not have a classification for what they used." The room went silent in the way rooms go silent when something has happened that changes the shape of the world. Letharu looked at the display for a long moment. Then he straightened. "Get me a channel to the human flagship," he said. It took 17 minutes to establish, not because the humans were unresponsive, but because the conclave's communication protocols had not included a standard procedure for contacting humanity in 50 years, and the relevant credentials had to be located and reactivated from archive. The humans, it turned out, had already queued a channel request from their end. They had been waiting. Commander Idris Akafer appeared on screen looking exactly as relaxed as if he were conducting a scheduled check-in. He was in his command chair on the bridge of the TCS Unbound. Behind him, his crew moved with the focused ease of people who had trained for this for years, and were now simply doing what they had prepared to do. "Grand Speaker," he said with a respectful nod, "thank you for making time." Letharu stared at him. He had prepared several opening statements on the way to the communication room. None of them seemed right now. "Commander," he said carefully, "you are in violation of conclave exile law." HFY nodded as if this were an interesting point. With respect, Grand Speaker, we would need to be members of the Conclave for its laws to apply to us. As of 50 years ago, we are not members. We have reviewed the relevant documentation thoroughly. Letheru paused. That was technically accurate. He had hoped the human would not notice. The exile, he said, was issued as a binding. As a binding condition of our removal from the community, HFY said, not unkindly. Which it was. We have been removed. We spent 50 years outside your community. We are not asking to come back into it. We are simply traveling through space, which, as I'm sure you are aware, belongs to no single governing body under any law that predates the Conclave's own charter. Another pause, longer this time. What do you want? Letheru asked. HFY leaned forward slightly. To talk to your neighbors, he said, the ones you haven't been talking to for them. He let that sit for a moment and then continued. There are 43 civilizations within this region of space that have never been granted Conclave membership. Several of them have been applying for over a century. Some of them have been actively discouraged from applying. They have had no independent trade access, no diplomatic representation in your chamber, and no alternatives because your network controlled every meaningful route they had. The Conclave's membership process has left a lot of people waiting in the dark for a long time, HFY said. We know what that feels like. We thought we would go introduce ourselves. And then, before Letheru could respond, the tactical display updated. New signals. The human ships in 17 systems were not simply holding position. They were moving toward the nearest non-conclave civilizations in each area, moving in pairs, broadcasting open transmissions that conclave intercept stations were already picking up and translating. The transmissions were not military. They were not threatening. They were introductions, trade proposals, offers of something called fold transit technology, freely given in exchange for nothing more than the right to talk. An aide leaned close to Letheru and said very quietly that 3 non-member species had already responded positively, and that the Haven civilization, which had been waiting on Conclave membership review for 87 years, had just transmitted what appeared to be an acceptance of a human trade offer. Letheru felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the station's gravity systems. He looked at HFY's image on the screen. The human commander was watching him with an expression that was not triumphant and was not hostile and was not apologetic. It was simply patient. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to live with it and was extending the same courtesy to everyone else in the room. You're dismantling our network, Letheru said. We are offering alternatives to people who have never had any, HFY said. What they choose to do is their decision. We won't be making it for them. That's rather the point. The channel stayed open. Neither side closed it. In 17 star systems, humans were talking to people who had never been talked to as equals before, and those people were listening with the full attention of those who had waited a very long time to be heard. The Conclave's emergency session ran for 9 hours without reaching a resolution, because the problem it was trying to solve had already solved itself in a direction no one in the chamber had seen coming, and the galaxy outside its windows was quietly, thoroughly, beginning to change. They exiled humanity from the galaxy, Earth's response. A smirk, then total freedom. The negotiations took 8 months. That was faster than anyone expected, though the speed had less to do with diplomacy moving quickly and more to do with the fact that the situation had already moved beyond the point where slow diplomacy could change very much. The Conclave could negotiate with humanity. It could not negotiate with the 43 civilizations that had, in the 8 months since the human fleet appeared, received fold transit technology and direct trade access, and the kind of attentive, equal-footing conversation they had never been offered before. By the time formal talks opened, 17 of those civilizations had signed agreements with the Terran Compact, not military agreements, not defense pacts, just trade, technology sharing, and a mutual commitment to what the compact called open corridor transit, the principle that no civilization should have to ask permission to travel through space that belonged to everyone. 3 more signed while the negotiations were still ongoing. The numbers were not the point. The precedent was. The conclave arrived at the table knowing it had already lost the thing that mattered most, the monopoly. Grand Speaker Letharu was not a foolish being. He understood leverage and he understood when it was gone, and he was experienced enough to know that the worst thing you could do in that situation was pretend it wasn't. He came to the table prepared to make real concessions, because the alternative was watching the conclave become irrelevant while insisting it was not. Commander Akafor led the human delegation. Director Vance was present technically as an observer, practically as the most important person in the room, because whenever a point came up that required a decision that mattered, Akafor would glance slightly to his left, and the delegation's position would firm up or shift in ways that had clearly been decided before the question was ever asked aloud. The conclave's opening position was a modified return to the old structure. Humanity could rejoin as a member, with rights and obligations, under an updated conduct framework that addressed the original charges. Akafor listened to the full proposal. He was quiet for a moment after it was finished. Then he said, "We appreciate the offer. We are not interested in rejoining." This produced a silence in the room. "Not interested," Letharu repeated carefully. "Membership requires us to accept conclave law and conclave oversight," Akafor said. "We have had 50 years without either of those things and found the experience productive. What we are interested in is a different arrangement entirely." He laid out the counter-proposal. It had been drafted over months, reviewed by every working group in the Terran Compact, and refined until it was so clean and so logically consistent that finding a flaw in it required effort. The conclave's legal team had been applying without success for 2 weeks since they received the advance copy. The proposal was simple. The conclave would be dissolved. Not in the sense of its member species losing their relationships with each other. Not in the sense of trade agreements being annulled or diplomatic channels being shut down. The civilizations that had been part of the conclave could continue to cooperate, form new agreements, and work together however they chose. But the conclave as a governing body, as the authority that decided who had access to which lanes, who could trade with whom, who was ready for the stars and who needed to wait, that structure would end. In its place, humanity proposed something called the Open Transit Accord, a simple, flat agreement available to any civilization that wanted to sign it, with no membership requirements, no behavioral assessments, no waiting period, and no governing body with the power to exclude anyone. You signed it, you got access to the fold transit network that humanity was building, and you agreed to the same access for everyone else who signed. That was all. No table to sit at, no head of the table, no gatekeepers. The conclave's senior delegates spent 4 days in closed sessions after the counter-proposal was formally delivered. Reports from inside those sessions, which leaked in the way that diplomatic secrets always eventually leaked, described the mood as somewhere between outrage and despair. Several delegates argued forcefully that the proposal was an attack on 3,000 years of galactic civilization. Others argued, more quietly, that 3,000 years of galactic civilization had left 43 species waiting outside the door, and that this was perhaps not the defense it appeared to be. Letharu requested a private meeting with Akafor. They met alone in a small room off the main chamber, with no aids and no recording equipment, and the understanding that nothing said there would appear in the official record. Letharu looked at the human commander for a long moment, and then asked the question he had been carrying since the day the quarantine veil came down. "How," he said, "you were cut off from everything, you were supposed to fall apart." Akafor thought about this. He thought about Vance in her viewing room at 4 in the morning, hand against the glass. He thought about Osai and her 9-person team in a cramped lab past the edge of the solar system, running a test that should not have worked. He thought about the workers who had built the fleet and the pilots who had trained in ships that did not yet exist, and the generations of children who had grown up under the veil and been told it was not a ceiling. "You assumed we needed you," he said. "We had chosen to cooperate with you, which is a different thing. When you removed the choice, we found out what we were actually capable of when no one was managing us." Letheru was quiet. "You took away every obligation we had," HFY continued. "Every treaty, every behavioral constraint we had accepted in exchange for access, every agreement that kept us operating within your framework. You handed us complete freedom and called it punishment." "We thought it would break you," Letheru said. "We know," HFY said. "That is why it didn't." The private meeting lasted 2 hours. What was decided in that room was never officially recorded, but when the formal sessions resumed the following morning, Letheru's position had changed. Not in the language he used, he remained careful and formal and precise, but in the direction he moved. He began steering the conclave's delegation toward acceptance rather than resistance. He did it slowly and with the skill of a politician who knew how to move large things by small degrees, and by the end of the 8th month, a version of the Open Transit Accord had been agreed upon. It was not exactly what humanity had proposed. It never was, but it kept the essential parts: no governing body with exclusion power, universal access, flat structure. The conclave's existing institutions would transition over 5 years into advisory roles with no enforcement authority. The hyperlane network would be integrated with the fold transit network humanity was building, and both would be available to all signatories without restriction. The signing ceremony was brief. HFY signed for the Terran Compact. Letheru signed for the transitioning conclave. 31 other civilizations signed on the first day, including 9 that had never before been part of any formal galactic agreement. There were no speeches. HFY had declined to give one. Vance, watching from a seat near the back of the room, had approved of this strongly. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, a young aide from the Voth Charon delegation, a descendant of the Grand Speaker who had issued the original exile verdict, approached HFY with the careful manner of someone carrying a message they were not sure would be welcomed. He said that the senior members of his family, aware of what their ancestor had done and what had followed, wanted to ask a question through him if that was acceptable. HFY said it was. The aide asked, how had humanity known to prepare when everyone had believed the exile was a surprise? HFY smiled. "We didn't know the exile was coming," he said. "We knew what we were building before it ever happened. The exile just gave us the time and the reason to finish." He shook the aide's hand and walked toward the docking bay, where the Unbound was waiting. In the months that followed, the Terran Compact's fold-capable ships dispersed across the galaxy in every direction. Not in formation, not under flags of conquest, not carrying officials or enforcers or inspectors. They carried traders and doctors and scientists and builders and people who were simply curious about what was out there and had been waiting their whole lives for a door to open. They went to the fringe systems and the forgotten corridors and the places the conclave's maps had always marked as unimportant. They talked to beings who had not been talked to in generations. They dropped off medical technology and communication equipment and fold transit relay nodes, and then they moved on, because staying was not the point, connection was the point, and connection did not require anyone to stand over it and manage it. The old woman who had started all of this did not go with the fleet when it dispersed. She stayed in the Sol system, in a small house on the coast of a continent she had grown up on. And she read the reports that came back from the ships and the new worlds they found, and the deals struck in places no conclave diplomat had ever bothered to visit. She read them with the same attention she had given every report for 50 years. On the day the 500th fold transit relay was activated, completing a network that covered more of the galaxy than the hyperlane system ever had. She sat on her porch in the late afternoon light and looked up at a sky full of stars that had always been there, waiting, and thought about a small, warm probe on a tray in a station past the edge of the solar system, and a scientist who had written at the bottom of a 7-sentence message, "We don't need their roads anymore." She had been right. They had never needed their roads. They had just needed time to build their own.